The palace did not wake gently. It never did. Stone corridors inhaled cold before dawn, and the Iron Monarch's stronghold rose like a clenched fist against the mountains, unyielding, unforgiving, built for power, not comfort. Servants moved through it like shadows trained not to exist, careful where they stepped, careful where they breathed. Somewhere deep within its iron-veined walls, two newborn cries cut through the silence, sharp and relentless, echoing again and again as if the palace itself could not contain them. The sound did not belong to hunger or discomfort. It sounded older than that. It sounded like something was wrong. Far below the royal chambers, where light barely reached and warmth was rationed like mercy, a girl scrubbed dried stew from a copper pot that had already been scrubbed twice before. Her hands were red, cracked, and smaller than they should have been for the work she did. Josie did not complain. Complaining required the belief that someone might listen. She kept her head down as laughter drifted above her maids whispering about nobles, guards boasting about battles, everyone belonging somewhere she did not. Wolfless. That was the word they used when they thought she couldn't hear. Sometimes when they knew she could. In a kingdom ruled by beasts and bloodlines, she was an error no one bothered correcting. The cries came again, louder this time, reverberating through the stone like a warning bell. Josie paused, fingers tightening around the pot's rim before she realized she'd stopped working. Something about the sound tugged at her chest, unfamiliar and unsettling, like a memory she'd never lived. She'd heard babies cry before servants' children, villagers passing through, but this was different. This wasn't noise. It was needed. Around her, no one reacted. A cook cursed under her breath. Another servant muttered about the cursed twins. The Iron Monarch's heirs, born strong and perfect, yet impossible to soothe. Nursemaids rotated through the nursery like sacrifices, each leaving pale and shaken, each swearing they'd never return. Josie went back to scrubbing, but the sound followed her, threading itself into her thoughts. She remembered being smaller, colder, hiding beneath a broken cart at the edge of the capital when the Iron Monarch's patrols thundered past. She remembered iron boots stopping, a shadow falling over her. Not cruelty, but calculation. The monarch had spared her that day, not out of kindness, but because she was insignificant. Too small to matter. That was the first lesson the palace taught her. Survival was not the same as being chosen. Above her, in chambers lined with silver and fur, the Iron Monarch stood unmoving while another nursemaid fled in tears. His jaw was carved from restraint, his authority absolute, but the sound cracked something beneath it. His son's blood would not be mastered. The palace whispered its fear behind tapestries and doors. Some said the twins rejected weakness. Others said the queen's absence had cursed them. None dared say the truth aloud. The Iron Monarch could command armies, but he could not command his own children. When the crying surged again, sharp enough to make even the cooks falter, Josie felt her breath hitch. She didn't know why her feet moved before her mind decided. She didn't know why she wiped her hands and stepped away from the kitchen, heart pounding like she'd committed treason. She only knew that something in those cries felt familiar, as if they were calling into a place no wolf had ever answered before. And as she reached the first stair leading upward into a world she was never meant to enter, one question pressed against her ribs, heavy and dangerous. What would happen if the Iron Monarch's heirs found comfort in the one person the kingdom had already rejected? The corridor leading upward felt narrower with every step, as though the palace itself were reconsidering her presence. Josie moved quietly, counting her breaths the way she always did when fear threatened to spill over. Slow in, slower out, yet the sound of the crying grew louder, more insistent, pulling her forward despite every rule she had learned about where she did and did not belong. Guards stood at intervals, their armor catching the torchlight, faces set in practiced indifference. None of them noticed the wolfless girl slipping past with her eyes lowered, because people like her were trained to disappear, and people like them were trained not to look twice. The nursery doors stood ajar, chaos leaking through the gap. Inside, the air was thick with panic and perfume, with the sharp scent of milk gone cold and the brittle calm of women on the edge of breaking. A nursemaid stood frozen near the cradle, hands trembling, while another whispered frantic reassurances that no one believed anymore. The twin pups' cries rose and fell in uneven waves, raw and unrelenting, their small bodies shifting with a restlessness that felt almost searching. Josie stopped at the threshold, invisible again, watching as yet another woman tried rocking them, humming an old wolf lullaby meant to honor bloodlines and strength. The pups only cried harder, tiny fists clenched, as if rejecting every word. She didn't announce herself. She didn't ask permission. She simply stepped closer, heart racing so loudly she was sure someone would hear it. The closer she got, the stranger the feeling became, like walking into a memory that belonged to someone else. The pup's cries stuttered when she reached the cradle, not stopping, but shifting, as though something new had entered the room and demanded to be assessed. The nursemaid shot her a sharp look, ready to scold, until something in Josie's face made her hesitate. There was no confidence there, no ambition, only an instinct she couldn't name, written plainly in the way her hands hovered, uncertain but gentle. When Josie lifted the first pup, the room seemed to hold its breath. He was warm, heavier than she expected, his small body vibrating with distress. She murmured nonsense without realizing it, soft sounds, not words, the kind you make when language feels too clumsy for what you're trying to say. The crying didn't stop immediately. It thinned, frayed at the edges. She adjusted her hold, tucking him closer, and felt something shift, subtle but undeniable, like a lock turning somewhere deep inside her chest. The second pup quieted next, his cries fading into uneven breaths, as if he were listening instead of screaming. No one spoke. The silence that followed was not peaceful, it was stunned. Josie swayed instinctively, the way she'd once seen village mothers do, her movements unpolished, untrained. Entirely her own. The pups' bodies relaxed against her, their tiny fingers curling into the fabric of her sleeve as though anchoring themselves. A soft, almost startled sound escaped one of the nursemaids. This wasn't how it was supposed to work. Wolves bonded through blood, through scent, through lineage. Not through a wolfless girl who smelled like soap and kitchen ash. Someone ran for the steward. Someone else whispered the Iron Monarch's title like a warning. Josie barely noticed. Her attention narrowed to the rise and fall of the pups' chests, to the way their tension melted, as if they had finally found something they'd been searching for without knowing it. She didn't feel powerful. She felt necessary. The difference unsettled her more than fear ever had. When the pups finally slept, truly asleep, the room exhaled as one, and every eye turned toward the girl who should not have been there at all. As guards approached and hurried voices filled the nursery, one thought echoed in Josie's mind, fragile and dangerous in equal measure. If the Iron Monarch discovered that his heirs found peace in her arms, would that make her protected or condemned? The days that followed blurred into a rhythm Josie never would have dared imagine for herself. She did not live in the nursery, not officially, but somehow she was always there when the cries began, as if the palace itself had learned to summon her without words. At first, the nursemaids hovered close, watching for some trick, some failure that would restore the old order of things. But each time the twin pups stirred and their voices rose, it was Josie they reached for, their small bodies twisting toward her presence before anyone else could move. She spoke little, sang nothing formal, and followed none of the old wolf customs. She simply held them, breathed with them, grounded them in a way no one else could replicate. It made no sense, and that made everyone uneasy. Whispers traveled faster than footsteps in the palace. Servants speculated in corners, guards exchanged glances that lingered too long, and the word wolfless began to sound less like an insult and more like a question no one wanted to answer. Josie tried not to listen. She focused on the simple truths in front of her, the weight of a sleeping pup, the way they're breathing even when her hand rested against their backs, the faintest flicker of warmth that settled in her chest whenever they looked at her with unfocused, trusting eyes. For the first time in her life, she was not being tolerated. She was being needed, and that frightened her more than rejection ever had. Paula, the senior maid, was the only one who spoke to her plainly. She watched Josie with a sharp, knowing gaze as she adjusted the nursery linens one evening, the pups sleeping soundly at Josie's side. "You're forgetting yourself," Paula said quietly, not unkindly but firm. "Palaces don't reward miracles. They punish disruptions." Josie wanted to argue, to explain that she wasn't trying to change anything, that she only wanted the pups to be calm and safe. But the words felt thin even as she thought them. Deep down, she knew Paula was right. Nothing that worked this well was allowed to remain untouched by power. The Iron Monarch returned without ceremony. There was no announcement, no trumpet blast, just a sudden tightening in the air, like a storm pulling the palace into alignment around him. Josie felt it before she saw him, a pressure that made her spine straighten and her pulse quicken. She stood near the cradle, one pup in her arms, the other stirring awake, when the doors opened and the room fell silent. The Iron Monarch stepped inside, his presence eclipsing everything else, eyes sharp, assessing, already displeased by what he did not yet understand. His gaze moved from the silent pups to the unfamiliar girl holding them, and something darkened in his expression. "Put them down," he ordered, voice calm in the way that made obedience instinctive. Josie froze, caught between reflex and fear. The pup in her arms whimpered softly, sensing the shift, and tightened his grip on her sleeve. The Iron Monarch noticed. His jaw clenched, not with relief, but with offense. This was not how his heirs were meant to respond. This was not the bond he had sanctioned. When Josie finally lowered the pup back into the cradle, the silence shattered, both twins crying at once, raw and panicked, their calm evaporating the instant she stepped back. The Iron Monarch's patience snapped. His anger was precise, controlled, and far more terrifying for it. He accused her of manipulation, of overstepping, of daring to place herself where she had no right to stand. Each word stripped away the fragile sense of belonging Josie had begun to build. She tried to speak, to explain that she had done nothing but care, but explanations held no value here. To him, she was not a solution. She was a problem that had grown too visible. When guards moved to escort her out, the twins screamed with renewed force, their distress echoing off the nursery walls as Josie was pulled away, her heart splintering with every step. That night, the palace returned to chaos. The cries did not stop. Nursemaids failed again. The Iron Monarch stood alone in the shadows, listening to his heirs reject every comfort he allowed them, his certainty cracking under the weight of a truth he refused to name. And far below, in the cold quarters where servants were meant to remain unseen, Josie sat awake, hands still aching as if they remembered the pup's warmth, wondering one unbearable thing: if the Iron Monarch could not control his sons, how far would he go to erase the one person they had chosen? The palace woke to a different kind of tension the morning the queen returned. It crept through the halls like a held breath, sharp and electric, carried on hurried footsteps and doors that closed too softly. Josie felt it before anyone told her anything had changed. Servants whispered her name again, not with curiosity this time, but urgency. Above her, the twin pups' cries had reached something wild and unfamiliar, no longer just need but anger, power stirring in small bodies that should not have known it yet. When the summons came, it wasn't gentle. Guards appeared at her door, faces unreadable, and for the first time since she'd entered the palace, Josie understood that being noticed could be more dangerous than being ignored. The queen stood in the nursery like a blade drawn slowly from its sheath, her presence colder than the Iron Monarch's rage. She took in the scene in silence, the unrest, the exhausted nursemaids, the twins straining toward the wolfless girl the palace had tried to erase. When Josie was pushed forward, accusations followed swiftly: trespass, manipulation, treason wrapped in polite language. The Iron Monarch did not defend her. He did not look at her at all. Judgment fell fast and clean. She was to be removed permanently before her influence spread any further. As guards seized her arms, the twins screamed not the thin cries of infants, but something deeper, something feral. Their eyes flashed, their small bodies shuddering as if answering a call no one else could hear. The dungeon swallowed Josie whole. Stone, damp, and silence pressed in from every side as the weight of the sentence settled into her bones. She tried to steady her breathing, to make sense of how quickly care had turned into condemnation. Above her, the palace fractured. The twins shifted for the first time, bones rearranging too early, power surging without control. Small wolf pups emerged where heirs had been, and with them came chaos. They would not be held. They would not be commanded. They tore through guards, slipped through gates, and followed instinct alone straight to the place where Josie was being held, crying for her with voices that shook the walls. What followed happened too fast to be clean. Doors burst open. Shadows clashed. In the confusion, a familiar hand pulled Josie free. Paula's face was pale but resolved. "You were never the mistake," she said, pressing a cloak into Josie's hands. "Staying here is." Together they fled into the forest, the twin pups bounding beside Josie, as if they had always known the path. Behind them, the palace roared with fury. Ahead, the woods closed in, dark and alive, until a figure emerged from the shadows, a rogue alpha, eyes sharp, power restrained, watching Josie not with dominance, but recognition. As dawn broke beyond the trees, Josie stood trembling, the pups pressed against her legs, choosing her again without hesitation. She had been called Wolfless her entire life, yet 2 future alphas had followed her into exile, without looking back. The palace, the throne, the Iron Monarch certainty, all of it felt suddenly smaller than the road ahead. And as the forest swallowed them whole, one truth settled in with quiet force. This was not the end of her story. It was the beginning of something the kingdom was never prepared for. If you want to know what happens next, how the Iron Monarch responds, what the Queen truly intends, and what Josie is becoming alongside the wolves who chose her stay with this story, like the video, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because the next chapter will change everything.